going to do a different thing today with presidents. We're going to do a block of them. They're the presidents who were in the 1920s, the roaring 20s, the jazz age, and they gave a certain feeling to the presidency. Their names are Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. And during that time, the country recovered from World War I and went all the way to the end of the decade and then crashed in the great crash on Wall Street. First, before we get going with that, I'd like to do a few things about the last time we met. One of the lady lawyers asked me about the Obamas and seemed to indicate to me that he was very interested in her and was willing to practice living together before they actually married. And her answer was no. The Obamas did meet in a law firm in Chicago, and she was assigned to be the mentor of this other African American who had come to the law firm, since there were only two of them. Mentorship is different than being the boss. And they remember, both of them, their first date. They went to see Mike Lee's film, and they were very happy with the film, and the relationship blossomed from there. The film was Do the Right Thing by Spike Lee. That answers one of the questions, I hope. Another woman asked me about the fact that Obama had another failure, which was his promise to draw a red line in Syria, and if the Syrian dictator used gas weapons against his own people, Obama would react. And when the dictator, Assad, used the gas weapons, Obama did nothing. And that certainly was an effort on his part to stay out of another Middle Eastern war. But at the same time, he had spoken that he would do something, and now he had betrayed that promise. What else? Well, I told you about all the wonderful things that happened in Cuba. I'll tell you about one more thing. On most of my trips there, I always made sure I didn't go in hurricane season. And secondly, I went when the Opera House was open. Because when the Castros took over Cuba, there was a great Cuban dancer who was a ballet dancer in New York, had appeared with the great companies like Ballet Theater. Her name was Alicia Alonso, and she had chosen to return to Cuba because she liked what she saw in the revolution. And when I would go there, she would always be in the house because the Cuban National Ballet was the creme de la creme of the Cuban art movement. And when I got to see her, it was late in her life, and she was blind. And she put on productions of Giselle as she remembered that ballet. And you could hear the people begin to cheer with their feet. They were stomping their feet on the floor when this small woman using a cane walked across the stage before the ballet began. So that was one of the wonderful things about Cuba. They exported many of their trained dancers. Several of them came and danced with San Francisco Ballet. They also exported a great number of baseball players because in Cuba, baseball has become the national game and they have very good players. So those players came and played with American teams. That was the upside, that's the good side. Now another downside of Cuba. The Castro brothers were white Cubans, and they had very little to do with a large number of black Cubans. Cuba had depended heavily on slaves when it was a Spanish colony because they needed the slaves to cut the sugar cane, which is backbreaking work, or to work in the tobacco fields, since Cuban tobacco and Cuban cigars are known all over the world. So that's the downside or the ugly side, that racism also was a part of the revolution, And in fact, I only knew one Afro-Cuban who got anywhere near the top in the Castro government, and he was in the military. So I've covered those aspects, I think. There might have been another question that I didn't get to because I can't remember everything. But let me tell you that this week, we celebrate a major event in American history. 100 years ago, women who had been demonstrating all during the Wilson administration for suffrage, that is, the right to vote. These were suffragettes. They went in front of Woodrow Wilson's White House and said, "Give me liberty." Reminded me of a famous Virginian who in a church, St. John's Church in Richmond, had given a very famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." The women dropped the death and just wanted liberty. And finally, they got it. Many men thought it was the end of the world, that it would in fact cause a major problem in political life, which it didn't. It's amazing. The sun still came up in the east and went down in the west, and yet women at last had the right and the privilege to vote, which I hope they will do again. It's almost November. That's one of the things we're celebrating in this early time. But the three presidents we're looking at, again, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, form a triumvirate that's best explained as the Jazz Age. Jazz was a phenomenon that came from the African American community in places like New Orleans, most remembered by Louis Armstrong, but also all the way up the Mississippi. There was a woman, a marvelous woman, Lady Day, Billie Holiday, who sang in the late 20s into the 30s and 40s. And Diana Ross made a very beautiful film about her life many years after she was dead. So it's the Jazz Age, the roaring Jazz Age. However, it's also the time of Prohibition. And again, many men thought this was the end of the world, particularly German men who couldn't get a beer, Italian men who couldn't get any vino, and particularly my people, the Irish, who thought this is the end of the world. And so we found a way to get it. We had bootleggers, and several of them became famous, particularly in the windy city of Chicago, very close to the Canadian border, where you could bring alcohol into the country. And because of that, we had national heroes. Elliot Ness, who became a FBI agent who tried to break up Al Capone's rackets. And he broke some, mainly finding the storage houses, the warehouses for the liquor, and then pouring it out down the gutters, which seemed a terminal offense to the Irish. Nevertheless, we went through the 20s dry, so to speak, but everyone knew where you could get a drink, bootlegging. Now, we had had problems with this in our early republic. In the time of George Washington, our very first president, the people who lived in the hills of Kentucky were unhappy because they couldn't get their corn crop to market. It was too far away. And so they turned their corn into bourbon or to liquor, whiskey. And this was known as the Whiskey Rebellion because, of course, they weren't paying taxes. And so Washington felt himself it was necessary to do something about it. So this in our early history, there was a Whiskey Rebellion, and Washington put it down. Now there is a rebellion again, and it's unstoppable. I'll tell you a little Berkeley and Bay Area history. During Prohibition, smart Canadians who thought we were crazy would bring ships down the coast of California and stay off the Farallones, which are islands right outside of the Golden Gate. And on a certain date in which the fog was rolling in, as it's wont to do, barges would come out, take off the supply of liquor in big barrels, and shoot through the Golden Gate into and across the bay to Berkeley. That's why you could always get a drink along San Pablo Avenue and in those famous fish restaurants at the end of University Boulevard, because they had the hooch that nobody else had. But we fought that all during the 20s. It took Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man who loved his martinis, to put an end to this foolishness which marked our age. But that age was the jazz age. People were happy. People were getting over the Great War in Europe, which had come to a calamitous end. Our president had fought and lost the battle for joining the League of Nations, a battle that was settled by a very mean-spirited senator from Massachusetts, Henry Cabot Lodge, who scuttled any chance for America to join the League of Nations, and which broke the heart of President Woodrow Wilson. We also had a very early, ugly scene in the United States. There was an attorney general by the name of Palmer, and these were the Palmer raids. And we were basically out to catch all the commies that had ever been or ever would be in the United States. And so already, following the famous October Revolution in Russia, which turned Russia into the Soviet Union, we had an ugly early clash with our long-standing anti-communist crusade. And one of our own people, very much involved with the idea that communism wasn't necessarily bad. Her name will live for a long time. It's Rosa Luxemburg. And she had a mission. She basically felt strongly enough to go to Berlin in this period right before 1920 itself. Why did she go there? Well, when the victorious Allies met in the great palace complex at Versailles, and when a very harsh treaty was foisted onto the German Empire, which was dissolved, along with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, along with the Turkish Empire, and the Russian Empire had already dissolved itself, a communist revolution broke out in Berlin. And so people of like minds ran there to see what was happening and to give their aid and assistance. And Rosa Luxemburg was one of those people. Needless to say, the reaction, even in the German right, was strongly opposed, and the German army, what remained of it, was sent into Berlin to crush this early communist uprising. You must remember that the first communist government was not in St. Petersburg or Leningrad, nor was it attempted first in Berlin. The first communist government anywhere in the world was in Paris. It was at the time of the loss of the Franco-German War, the Russo-German, the Prussian War. And in that process, the communists took over, the communards, the city of Paris. And again, the French sent in the French army. The French are rather thorough about things like this. In their own revolution, they developed a little knife that fell from the sky. It's called the guillotine. and you collect a lot of heads in baskets, and in no time, you have rid yourself of a whole class of people. In this particular time, the French army simply lined the communards up against the wall and shot them. So that was the end of the famous Paris Commune, and now the Berlin uprising, but not the case in the Soviet case, because they stood tall and fought back. Red Russians against white Russians. They murdered their own czar out in a central part of Russia, still noted today. The bones of the czar, his czarina, his children, to include Anastasia, have been found. They've been brought back to what is now St. Petersburg again and buried with the other great czars in the Peter and Paul fortress. But we're desperate times. But in America, we wanted not to be involved, not to get entangled. And so we got no entry into the League of Nations, and we elected a man named Harding. Warren Harding was from a small town in Ohio, Marion, Ohio. And he liked the small towns. He liked the countryside. And when he came to the convention, he had been in politics in Ohio. He was a dark horse. But unbelievable, the convention came to a stalemate. And so he was brought forward and he was elected, or at least nominated, to be the Republican candidate, and he won with his famous vice president, Calvin Coolidge. Now, in this particular case, Harding did not follow the advice of serious people who have looked at the presidency and said, if you are going to have an affair while you're president, try and have an affair with a woman who does not plan to write a book. And also try and think about using safe sex so that a baby does not arrive. Well, unfortunately, Harding listened to neither of those, and therefore there was a woman, and she did write a book, and there was a baby. And this caused a sensation. And so it was that Harding, dealing with a illicit romance, also had to deal with a huge financial scandal. His Secretary of the Interior was involved. It turned out that the United States Navy, as dependent as it was on oil, had two big preserves, one in Wyoming and one in Southern California. This all goes under the name of the Teapot Dome scandal. And it finally leaked out that this oil had been sold to the Sinclair oil people, and the money had been pocketed by people in the Harding administration. And so we have that phenomena that goes on in the 20th century, where people in administrations go to jail. Mitchell went to jail, Attorney General for Nixon. Recent people in the current administration have gone to jail. In fact, there are so many in jail that we ought to open a special jail for politicians. So here was Harding with two terrible problems, a sex scandal and a money scandal. So when you have problems like that, what do? Well, you travel, you get out of Washington, get away from the press. And so he went west, all the way to California. On his way here to California, he began to have chest pains. His doctor thought it was indigestion. When he came into San Francisco, he insisted on walking all the way to the Palace Hotel. And it was in the Palace Hotel that Harding kicked the bucket. He died. Some people said his wife probably snuck into town and killed him. His wife was known as the Duchess, and she was not pleased about this other woman. But now Harding was dead. Big funeral, all the trimmings, and Calvin Coolidge from up in Maine was now president of the United States. Coolidge tried to calm the waters. He saw that there had been some good things done in the Harding administration, and he tried to reap the bounds of those good things. For instance, in foreign policy, there had been a naval limitations treaty signed with the leadership of the United States. This limited the number of capital naval ships that could be built by the United States, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. And it was approved. And so here we had a good thing that had been done. And it was things like that that Calvin also wanted to move against. He also was not a racist. He knew no African Americans. Maine is not the center of African American life. And so it was that he supported bills like the anti-lynching bill, which you would assume would have passed and which did not. It was a shame that in so many ways everything that was good was touched by racism. It might be strange to you women in the audience to know that when the suffragettes won their great battle and got the vote, they had been struggling for a long time, since the early 1900s. They had stood out in front of Woodrow Wilson's White House and said, "Give me liberty." However, even the suffragettes, they announced to the African American women that they did not want them to march with them. So in every way, the evil of racism touched so many subjects, so many things that were meant to do good, carried with them the evil of racism, the baggage of racism. But the golden age went on. The 1920s, bathtub gin, flappers, doing the Charleston, that wonderful new dance craze that swept the nation. Reading a wonderful, wonderful novella, a short novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald called The Great Gatsby. It's been filmed 3 times, neither time capturing the essence of that beautiful book. But even Scott's life came to a bitter end. He was married to a very beautiful woman from Alabama, Zelda Fitzgerald. They had been part of that lost generation in Paris after World War I. Those American intellectuals and artists who couldn't go home again stayed on in Paris. They found a center where they could all meet. There was living in Paris at the time a woman, very famous woman from Oakland, California. She once infamously said, "Oakland, there's no there there." Well, I'm here to tell Gertrude Stein that there is there there. There's Bean Mountain Gardens, for instance. And Stein, with her friend, Alice, collected artists and ran a very famous American salon in Paris. She knew everybody and everybody came. The young Ernest Hemingway came and showed Alice his first novel. F. Scott Fitzgerald came. A young painter up from Spain who just finished his blue and pink rose period and was joining with Georges Braque to create a new school of painting in Paris. And he came, and Gertrude Stein bought his paintings, showed him around, introduced him. It's very famous that these infamous, these two, the American Stein, who actually supported Franco in Spain, which broke her relations with Picasso, and Picasso himself. They stayed in Paris during the Nazi occupation of France, which is a very dangerous choice for Gertrude Stein because she was Jewish. But stay she did. And the others scattered to the many sides of the French and American scene. Hemingway was famous in those days for writing The Sun Also Rises, a beautiful novel made into a very awful film with an aging Tyrone Power and an aging Ava Gardner, both wrong for the roles, but with a dynamic of all people, Errol Flynn, who stole every scene he was in. This was the first time in The Sun Also Rises that Americans even heard of the running of the bulls down in Spain, because all the characters who were in the book went to Spain for this very famous event in Spanish bullfighting history. And so it appears in detail in the book and in the movie that did follow. Hemingway went on to write, of course, his greatest of his three great novels, Farewell to Arms, which has never, ever been filmed decently. Last time it was filmed was with, of all people, an aging Jennifer Jones and a very gay Rock Hudson. When Hemingway was then in Cuba, discovered this and found a check for $30,000 from David Selznick, who was making the film. He sent the check back to Selznick with the following note: if you are going to cast your 30-year-old plus wife as my 18-year-old British nurse, you need this check worse than I do. Hemingway. But Hemingway's early days in Paris made him remember that it was the early times that mattered. He wrote a book later, The Paris Wife. He himself had volunteered for the Great War and had gone to Italy to drive an ambulance even before we were in the war. And he was there to see the great battle at Caporetto in northern Italy, and to put all of this into his first masterpiece, Farewell to Arms. Unfortunately for the others, Dos Passos, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Zelda, they left Paris. Zelda was mentally ill. She finally had to be committed. Scott was depressed. He went to Hollywood, began to write for films. He then started a very famous affair with a writer, Sheila Graham, who then wrote the love affair up in a wonderful long book about her being in love with Scott Fitzgerald, Beloved Infidel. And then Scott died. A sad end to a great writer's. But in the 20s, nobody knew this was going to happen to them. And so here they were, the lost generation in Paris, taking advantage of everything Paris had, meeting Picasso, meeting a young orphan girl who'd just come out of the orphanage and had started designing clothes. And she was determined to free women from the baggage they carried in the form of girdles and this, that, and the other, and let their shapes be their shapes. And so it was that Coco Chanel came onto the scene. It's impossible to understand how rich this atmosphere was, because also in Paris at that time were a group from Russia, the Ballet Russe, led by the great Diaghilev, and his company involved all the best dancers that he could bring with him out of the now Soviet Union, to include the very young George Balanchine, who will soon leave Paris and go to New York to found the New York City Ballet. And among these Russians was probably the greatest dancer of the 20th century, who went also crazy and had to be committed. Also was his first wife, that is Diaghilev's, and then Balanchine. Her name was Alexandra Danilova. She had been a baby ballerina. She had left in her teens and come to Paris. And when she was 80 years old, she still danced. She danced the glove seller in Gaîté Parisien. It was an amazing group of artists, and they all mixed and matched. In the early days of the Ballet Russe, since he was unemployed and not famous, Picasso helped paint the sets. In the early days of Ballet Russe, since she was not yet famous, Coco Chanel designed some of the costumes. It was a melange of talent not seen before or since, working together in this strange after the war lost generation. And as this continued, we had to continue with our presidencies. The Coolidge people had put in legislation to end lynching, and it had failed to pass the Senate. Coolidge himself gave an address at the great African-American University of Washington, Howard University. Nothing helped. We went on, nothing to drink. We got bootlegged liquor. You might want to know, well, let me start at the back side of this story. At this time, silent films were coming into their own. This is before talkies. And there were two glamorous European women who were both doing silent films. One was the incredibly beautiful Greta Garbo, who finally left Stockholm with an invitation from Louis B. Mayer to star in a large number of silent films at Metro. And the other was a woman who always denied she'd ever made silent films because she disliked Garbo intensely, and she was at Paramount. She didn't get to Paramount until 1930. And when she came with her famous director. She'd made many very poor films in Berlin, silent films. And then there was this one giant of a filmmaker who saw possibilities with Marlene Dietrich, and put her in a film that she will always be famous for, The Blue Angel. And she was a sensation. And she arrived on the Paramount lot with her famous director, and they made 6 wonderful films together. I've seen most of those films, but I once got to see Dietrich in the flesh. After her film career was over, she decided to do a one-woman show. And she launched it in Las Vegas. She'd had a designer, Bob Mackey, design a dress for her. Tight-fitting, you could see through it. She wore a famous wig. She'd learned that from her Hollywood days that she looked best if she put in her wig little light bulbs that gave a certain glow to her face. And she had those light bulbs in that wig. And she came to the Luntfontein Theater in New York, and I went. I'd heard my mother and father talk about her. And I must say, she was something from another world. And what was strange was I was sitting in the audience with a large number of people I realized were Germans, German Americans. And when she started singing the songs from the Blue Angel, these men, old men, were weeping for the Berlin that they had lost and would never recover. She got rousing applause. She does not have a good voice, but she was still a looker. Hemingway knew her. He called her the Great Kraut. But Hemingway liked Hollywood women. He was wild for Ava Gardner, who visited him at his finca in Havana. Gardner, of course, being Gardner, swam nude in Hemingway's swimming pool, which also was a plus as far as Ernest was concerned. He was also the friend of many Hollywood's male stars, particularly Gary Cooper, who he strongly recommended for his third great novel, For Whom the Bells Toll. It's a great film. Ingrid Bergman, Gary Cooper, a Greek actress, Katrina Paxino. They made that not on location in Spain, given that Franco wasn't about to let an American film crew run in and make a film about how terrible he was. So they made it down in Sonora, a little place at the Sonora Pass. There's a town there. And the hotel there is where the cast stayed. And if you go into that hotel and have lunch, where I do go, you will find pictures of all these people on the wall. It's also the place where later Cooper came back again, this time with Grace Kelly, to make High Noon, two great American films made in Sonora. But this was way after the 20s. During the 20s, things rolled on. We tried as best we could to hold it together. There were problems on the horizon. Our agriculture sector was so productive, it was overproducing and could not sell all that it raised. And so farm prices were depressed all during the 1920s. A bad sign for things to come. When Coolidge went, Hoover came. Probably most famous today for the Hoover Dam. In the days when we were building giant dams across our great western rivers. So it was that Hoover tried very much to stay on top what seemed to be an enormous problem in the American economy. And he was right. There was a problem. And to keep from going into great detail, let me just say that in 1929, in October and September, the bottom fell out of the roaring 20s. The great crash on Wall Street saw profits eliminated. Less people jumped out of windows at Wall Street than have been reported, but it wasn't so many brokers that were broke, it was the American people. They had been sold a lot of watered stock. And when the calls came in, nobody could make the call. And while even the Rockefellers rushed in to spend a lot of money to bolster and boost up, it lasted only a few hours, and then the decline began. It was global, so there was no fix. It actually began with a bank failure in Austria. And in Germany, which was already suffering terribly from the reparations payments to France, and now a depression that will be global, and then with the failure of the London Stock Exchange, the failure of the French Bourse. And what did everyone do? They all closed their doors. The French franc would stay only in the franc zone. British pound only in the pound zone. American dollar only in the dollar areas. Trade came to a halt. People who depended on trade floundered and then failed. The Great Depression was upon us. There was a man, British, he'd been to Versailles for the famous treaty, there were 5 treaties at Versailles. The most famous one, the Treaty of Versailles itself, dealt only with the German Empire and basically ended that Second Reich. Kaiser went into exile in the Netherlands, and the German economy was awash, and Berlin in the hands of the communists. So it was that this man, this British economist who had been a young man with the British delegation at Versailles, shook his head and saw that built into this treaty was a future disaster. His name is Lord Maynard Keynes. And Keynes had a theory about how you could get out of these depressions, recessions, whatever. You could spend your way out. But no one paid him any attention. It sounded like a crazy scheme. And later, when he's invited to Franklin Roosevelt's White House in the early 30s, Roosevelt said he was sorry, but he did not believe that Keynes had a solution. And Keynes said of Roosevelt, first-rate temperament, totally ignorant of economics. It is a sad comment on America that we did get out of the Great Depression, basically, because of the wild spending that was necessary in World War II. Excuse me. But no one knew that in the 20s. And so in the 20s, we rode along. We had heroes. We'd earlier had two sort of crazy guys from Ohio, again. They'd gone down to a place in the South we call the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Kitty Hawk. And they'd flown this contraption known as an airplane. And they'd succeeded. And so very surely, airplane by airplane, trial and error, we were going into the air. Young people were fascinated. We would soon see Bill Boeing graduate from Harvard and go up to Seattle and form a little airplane company you call Boeing. We'd also have another guy go to Long Beach in Southern California and find himself building huge numbers of aircraft. And we had another guy, McDonald, go to St. Louis. They were all over the place. They wanted to build the new flying machines. And then there was the golden boy of the 1920s and an airplane. The airplane was called the Spirit of St. Louis. And the Spirit of St. Louis, with Charles Lindbergh at the controls, was going to fly across the Atlantic nonstop all the way to Europe, from America's East Coast to France's West Coast. And he did. And he landed in France to great celebration. The French took to him as a great hero. Charles Lindbergh, married to a wonderful woman who wrote a wonderful book. And they had a wonderful child. And then they had their tragedy, the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. It seems like everything in the 20s started high and ended low. And so it was with Lindbergh. But while he was high, he was the golden hero of the 20s. He met both Coolidge and Hoover. They thought he was wonderful. America thought he was wonderful. Not far behind Mr. Lindbergh was a woman. She was the first woman as a co-pilot to fly with one other person across the Atlantic, but she had bigger dreams than that. She wanted to fly across the Pacific. Her name is Amelia Earhart. And at the end of the 20s, she began her climb up, which ends in tragedy with her disappearance over the Pacific. Finally pronounced dead many years later because she was lost. So was a generation of people in Paris, the lost generation. Those who came back found themselves lost again. You don't go to Hollywood to find yourself. What you do is you go to Hollywood and become a heavy drinker, F. Scott Fitzgerald. You find a lover, Sheila Graham, and she writes a book. So if you look across that decade, a decade of 3 mediocre presidents, you find yourself wondering what it was all about. Dancing the Charleston, flappers. A flapper is a young woman in a very short skirt who can really dance the Charleston. who could teach you things you thought you never would learn. The Americans found drink wherever they could. One of the people that helped bring alcohol into the country illegally was Jack, Bobby, and Teddy Kennedy's father. And there are places still marked in Chicago, very much near the Chicago Mart, where old man Kennedy saw to it that the spirits that he wanted crossed from Canada to the U.S. He was also very much involved in Hollywood in the 20s, in the silent film business. And while there, the senior Mr. Kennedy met a movie star. Her name was Gloria Swanson. Little did he know that as she faded in Hollywood, she would come back again, thanks to William Holden and Billy Wilder in a famous revival of her career, Sunset Boulevard. But this was when Swanson was young. She was a flapper, along with any number of other gals who came to Hollywood. Out of Texas came Joan Crawford in films like The Dancing Daughters. And in the process of her career being over, Mr. Kennedy Sr. fell in love with her and moved her to an apartment complex in New York, a very well-known hotel, where he kept her. I also got to see Gloria Swanson. I'd gone to New York to see a play, 5 or 6 in matter. One of them was Butterflies Are Free. And Swanson was in that play. So like a lot of other young fools, I waited around backstage, at the stage door, to see her. And finally, she came out. No longer young, wearing gloves to hide the spots on her hand, with a high-necked blouse on, and lots of makeup. And she looked fabulous. She laughed and she talked. And we walked behind her to the curb where she got into her limousine and went off. So you never know who you'll trip over, either on Broadway, in Hollywood, or in Paris. Part of that whole scene is still with us. I suggested to you that Picasso came to Paris. He'd finished his rose and his blue period. He was now working with George Braque and creating a new school. And the masterpiece for Picasso is the Mademoiselles of Avignon. And because of the Rockefellers and their money, we have that painting in the New York museum called MoMA, Museum of Modern Art. And it's breathtaking, as were so many of the things that Picasso did when he was serious. We also had in that museum for a very long time his magnificent anti-war painting, the Guernica. Guernica being that small town in northern Spain that was destroyed by Hitler's air power, the Condor Legion, that obliterated this town on a Sunday morning when all the villagers would be out shopping. So outraged was Picasso when word came to Paris that he painted this fantastic piece of anti-war art. And then to make sure it didn't fall into Nazi hands, he had it sent to the United States for safekeeping. And for many years I used to see it hanging in MoMA. But in his will, he bequeathed that great painting to Spain. And when Franco died and the Republic came back and Juan Carlos was made king, the painting came back. It hangs in Madrid today, not in the Prado, but in the Queen's Museum. And it's worth a trip. As for all these places mentioned today, traces of them remain. Parts of those periods remain. The books all remain. You can certainly go out and read The Great Gatsby again. It's a wonderful book. Captures the hopes, aspirations, and then Gatsby dies, falls into a swimming pool, shot by a man who thinks that Gatsby, and Gatsby probably did when he wasn't looking, had hit the man's wife, who had then died. The 20s started big, ended bad. Hoover tried everything he could. Hoovervilles grew up all over the country. That didn't work. He couldn't get people back to work. He couldn't get people to invest. The market continued to go down, would have bursts going up and then down again. There was in trouble after trouble. There was a dust bowl in the Midwest. The farms were blowing away because we had planted in such a way that the loose earth became dust and became a blowaway. Steinbeck will capture that later in one of his great California novels, The Grapes of Wrath, where the Joad family leaves Oklahoma, makes its way in a broken down old truck, Mother Joad, all of them, a great film with Henry Fonda. They make it to the orange groves of California. I'll tell you a little story. The Soviets tried to get motion pictures about the bleak status of many groups in America. And they chose to get a copy and show to ordinary Soviet citizens of The Grapes of Wrath as a movie with Henry Fonda. And it backfired on them. Because what the Soviet audience said was, after the film was over, where did the Americans get that truck? And how could they afford the money for gasoline to drive all the way across their country? We don't have anything like that. Some people's bad times are other people's good times. The Soviets were going through an enormous famine. And we were hanging tough, but we were hanging on. Now, the next time we meet, we're going to talk about 3 presidents again from the Progressive era. This is 1900 to 1920. This is Teddy Roosevelt, and then Howard Taft, and then the last of 8 Virginia presidents, Woodrow Wilson. 3 presidents in a time of reform who did much to change the very nature of American society, since we've only had 3 periods of reform in the 20th century: the Progressive period, 1900, 1920, the New Deal, 1932 through Truman in 44, and then Lyndon Baines Johnson and the Great Society. So we'll go back to the progressives to see if we can find some part of our past that's meaningful even today. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week.